said, okay.
I would like to call the school board meeting for July 7th, 2015 for the Des Moines Schools to order. Please take the roll.
Ms. Caldwell-Johnson.
Here.
Mr. Howard. Here. Ms. Boson. Here. Ms. Ellsberg.
Here.
Mr. Barron.
Here.
Mr. Sweeney.
Here.
Mr. Blake.
Here.
First item on our agenda is approval of the agenda. May I have a motion and a second to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Howard, second by Mr. Blake. Please vote. Motion passes 7-0. Next item on our agenda is approval of the minutes. May I have a motion and a second to approve minutes from June 16th, 2015?
Move approval.
Second.
Motion by Boson, second by Barron. Please vote. Motion passes 6-0 with one abstaining. Next on the agenda is the consent items. We allow any person the opportunity to speak to the board for up to 5 minutes following the presentation of an agenda item. If anyone wishes to speak to an agenda item, please go to the information desk to sign up. Remarks must be germane to the agenda, and we ask that you avoid reference to personalities and character attacks, as these types of comments serve no productive purpose. As a reminder to the board and public, the board will not engage in discussion or deliberation with the speaker regarding comments made to agenda items. Discussion and deliberation will remain among board members at the board table, with speakers' comments informing said discussion, deliberation, and determinations as deemed necessary. We appreciate your input. Mr. Barron, do you have the motion?
I do. I move that the board approve the consent items in accordance with the recommended action for each item on the consent agenda, including bills previously authorized and certified by the secretary and approved for payment by the board chair in the amount of $11,286,035.45 and unpaid bills in the amount of $7,701,577.34.
Is there a second?
A second.
We have a motion by Mr. Barron, a second by Ms. Boson. Any discussion? Please vote. Motion passes 7-0. Next item on the agenda is item D1, public hearing for Mann Education Center asbestos abatement. The public hearing will come to order. Is there anyone wishing to speak to item D1, public hearing for Mann Education Center asbestos abatement? Hearing no one, I'll close the public hearing. Dr. Ahart, would you please introduce the matter?
I recommend the board approve the plans and specifications for the asbestos abatement project at the Mann Education Center.
May I please have a motion and a second to approve the plans and specifications?
So moved. Second.
A motion by Mr. Blake, second by Mr. Sweeney. Please vote. Motion passes 7-0. Next on our agenda, we have item E1, Elementary Literacy Monitoring Report. Matt Smith, Noel Tiki, Susie Tallman, and Wilma Geidel. Please come up.
I'll start talking on about that. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for having us tonight. We're here to present and discuss elementary literacy monitoring report, and it's the first of its kind because, you know, typically what we've done is taken all the elementary data points into one gigantic monitoring report. So it's the first of its kind, being that it's our new process of talking about student achievement each and every month. And so this is a much more focused report, particularly on elementary literacy, just in the elementary level. Tonight, I've got with me my band of angels. Two of them are up here, and there are several of them in the audience, as you can see. And so presenting tonight here are Noel Tiki, Executive Director for Teaching and Learning, and Susie Tallman, Executive Director for Elementary Schools. There are a few key performance indicators that I wanted to point out that this monitoring report will discuss and that we'll review tonight. There's 4 to be exact. We're going to discuss the FAST assessment, which is its first year in administration this school year for both the first grade and kindergarten levels. And we're also going to talk about the state accountability test, the Iowa assessment, and the student's proficiency rate in grades 3 through 5, as well as the typical growth on our state accountability assessment in grades 4 through 5. And I will turn it over to Susie Tallman.
Okay, the FAST Early Reading Assessment is an assessment tool that allows teachers to screen and progress monitor in order to be more efficient in identifying students and targeting their instruction. Like Matt said, this is our first year of implementation, and FAST stands for Formative Assessment System for Teachers. It was given this year to kindergarten and first grade students 3 times throughout the school year. And because it is a screener and used to progress monitor, it helps gives teachers an early warning sign in regard to students that are at risk for not meeting the expected benchmarks by the end of 3rd grade. So it helps identify more quickly and efficiently. You will not receive information on the SRI as you've received in the past, because moving forward we'll be administering the FAST assessment with 2nd and 3rd grade. When you take a look at the Iowa assessment data today, you'll be provided the percent proficient, those students who scored at or above the cut score, as well as typical growth, looking at student increases in the standard score points from year to year. So the first graph that has been provided is in regard to early reading, the early reading assessment at kindergarten and first grade. And the percent that you see on the graph actually is telling you the percent of students at that grade level that are on track, or you could say making adequate progress for meeting their reading skills. And so I think that that's an important point to make when you're taking a look at it. Also, that because the early reading assessment is a screener, one of the things that it does do is it over-identifies students that are not on track for making progress. And part of the reason for that is to make sure that no students are slipping through the cracks. So I think that that's another point to be aware of when you're looking at the data on that slide. And the benefit of that is it's supposed to help teachers to be more timely and efficient in looking at, you already know the students based on this screener who are on track and making adequate progress, so you can dig in a little bit more deeply and take a look at prioritizing where you want to start with students based on what that information is telling you or providing for you. The next slide highlights our reading proficiency on the Iowa assessment, grades 3-5. And if you take a look, from 2012 to 2014, elementary students in grades 3-5 have increased by 2.8% as being proficient. And then you'll also notice from 2014 to 2015, there was a slight decrease of 0.1%. When looking at typical growth on the Iowa assessment, it shows that there was a decrease from 2014 to 2015, but if you're looking from 2013 to 2015, you'll see that there was a 5.1% higher than the percent making growth in 2013. And part of the reason for the difference in the data that you're seeing on this slide was due to the form that was given in 2013 and 2012 and 2013. It is the similar form that is given, but in the year of 2014, a different form was used. So if you're wanting to do an apples to apples comparison, you really need to be looking at the 12-13 school year in comparison to the 15 school year. So that's why you notice a difference.
Like, will they switch up forms again, or was that a one-time thing? I can't remember.
Next year, we're scheduled to give Form F. Is that correct, Mary?
So we're going to have to,
Yeah.
So it will switch again.
It'll be the same.
From last year
It'll
to
be the
this
same.
next
Okay.
year.
The next 6 slides depict the same assessments, but with the sub-pops, so some supportive data to give us a deeper dive into the performance of our students. This first slide provides us with a detailed breakdown of the performance of students in each of our subpopulations. Again, the FAST assessment, and this is regarding the FAST assessments for kindergarten and first grade. The FAST assessment is the first year of its administration, so this will serve as baseline data for us moving forward as we continue to administer the FAST. Our most notable gaps are with our students in special education, and of course, we've got some gaps with students, African-American students, our ELL students, students on free and reduced lunch, and our Hispanic students. So we have gaps there in our first year administration of this data that we will definitely pay attention to and be aware of and provide interventions for moving forward.
I wanted to mention too, in case the board isn't aware, the Chapter 62, which is the third grade retention legislation, is what brought FAST to us. So we will be giving this K3, and this is going to be the data that that we will be required to use to make a determination about third grade retention in FY17.
This slide represents grades 3 through 5 reading Iowa assessment, our percent proficient trend also by subpopulations. You'll see again a huge gap in the achievement proficiency of our students in special education, and you'll also see that in ELL. The reason I continue to point out special education, ELL, and you'll see a free or reduced lunch as well here as well, is because we've got some new graphs that I think you've seen now that help us to dive deeper into some of our other subpopulations, and we'll go to that here in just a second. But again, looking at the achievement levels, we've had a slight dip from last year to this school year, and actually we increased, saw a slight dip from last year to this school year, but we do have a few populations that made improvements, most notably in our multiracial subpopulation. If we look at typical growth in our next slide, for grades 4 or 5 reading Iowa assessments, you'll see a similar trend. Again, looking at comparing apples to apples from 2013 to 2015 is the most valid comparison when looking at the test forms and the students' growth. The percent of students making at least typical growth increased from 2013 to 2015 with all subgroups, with the exception of special education students who experienced a decrease of 2.39%.
Are any of these changes either positive or negative statistically significant?
Invite Mary up.
Statistician
Maybe
behind
a
it.
little bit.
There she is. So earlier when I mentioned Band of Angels, here's Mary.
Yes, because we have a large enough population with all these groups that any change more than about 0.1% is statistically significant, just because we have that large size.
Even within the subpopulations within some of these grades, is it still significant enough?
Because we're still looking at grade levels combined. So you think about that, it's a lot. It still is a lot of kids. Oh, I'm gonna make them stay up here.
Thank you.
Yes.
Let's see. This particular slide indicates the percent of students making at least typical growth in grades 4 and 5 on their reading assessment. I think this is the slide that we were just on, correct? Okay. This chart is the first of its kind that we've presented, and I think it does a nice job of allowing us to dive deeper into our subpopulations. And what we elected to do was to provide you with a deeper dive into our African American, Hispanic, and our Asian subpopulations in order to provide you with a more detailed breakdown of those subpopulations and how many of those students, for example, that are African American and receive free or reduced lunch, that are ELL as well. And so it allows us to get a clearer picture of some of the things that we need to look at as a school district and as a system and at the individual building level to begin to assist and help these students to achieve at higher levels. So in 2015, 94% of our African American students, around 94%, were ELL and or free and reduced lunch. And even as the ELL and free and reduced lunch percentages are slowly increasing among African American students, our achievement is still on the steady rise from 42.3% in 2012 to 47.1% in 2015. That's an increase of 4.8%. The next slide gives the same information for our Hispanic students. In 2015, nearly 94% of our Hispanic students were ELL and or on free and reduced lunch. This figure has remained relatively stable since 2012, when the percentage was around 93.2%. The achievement of Hispanic students has increased 1.9% from 2012 to 2015. There was a slight decrease of 1% from last year to this current school year. And we have a similar graph for our Asian subgroup. In 2015, 88.6% of Asian students were ELL and or on free reduced lunch. And our ELL and free and reduced lunch percentages are slowly increasing among our Asian students from 85.1% in 2012. Achievement is still on the steady rise from 53.2% in 2012 to 54.9% in 2015. And that's an increase of 1.7%. Actually, let me move over. No, sorry.
So what does this mean for all of us? What is our response to the data? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're calling a multi-tiered system of support, and also know that this is a giant system, and we're just choosing to select a few things to talk about that specifically pertain to this early literacy data. So it's really a two-pronged approach. Big picture, 30,000-foot view, what we're looking at and what our plans are, they're really around two things. One is improving instruction that all students receive, core instruction. We know that we can't possibly intervene around 50% of our students. So we know that the first thing we have to do is improve core instruction, and I'll talk about what that looks like. The second thing that we have to do is we have to provide system-wide interventions for students that are guaranteed regardless of where they attend schools and regardless of the school's resources. And so that's been a little sporadic historically, and now it's going to be a pretty tight system that is common across the district. So in regards to the state requirements and actually what's being asked of us from the state is actually a really good thing. We have the universal screening, which Susie talked about, the FAST assessment that's going to help us better identify where students have gaps. We're also going to expand. We gave it K1 this year. We're going to add on second and third grade next year, and that will be administered 3 times a year. Then for students who are identified as at risk of not meeting those expected reading benchmarks, they will have regular progress monitoring by the classroom teacher, and so that we're constantly keeping tabs on those students and responding accordingly. For those K3 students who are identified as substantially deficient, those are the ones who continually surface as having deficits. They'll be progress monitored weekly and receive targeted intervention in addition to the services and instruction that all students receive. So this is above and beyond what all students are getting. So that's really in regard to that second item, that targeted intervention. The bigger challenge is improving core instruction that all students receive so that we can get ahead of our problem. If we always live in response mode, we'll exhaust our resources and constantly be playing catch up. So the better approach and the longer term solution is to improve core instruction that all students receive. So that's really happening in 3 ways. really, and you've probably heard already about a lot of this, is we're adopting and have already begun training of a district-wide model of instruction. It's called our instructional framework. And for the first time, at least in my 15 years in Des Moines, we have finally defined commonly what good teaching is. It's broad, it's comprehensive. Teachers can find their practices pretty much anywhere in that framework, but we'll have a common definition of good instructions to allow us to strategically improve our practice. Another part of improving core instruction is improving the support that the instructional leaders at the site level are providing to teachers. And that's really the work of our Wallace Grant, which you've heard a lot about, and that leadership development of improving the instructional leaders that are in buildings and closest to classrooms. And that's really happening through our Wallace work and the work of Office of Schools. On our side, Office of Academics, our instructional coach program is renewed and focusing on helping teachers implement that instructional framework that I just talked about. And that will be viable and feasible through the TLC grant that we've received from the state. And then additionally, and we've talked a lot about this, and close to my heart is implementation of standards reference grading in grades 4 and 5 starting next year to allow us not only to increase rigor, consistency of expectations from school to school, but again, being really targeted and knowing what exactly our students have mastered and where we need to continue to support. And the last thing is in regards to programming. We've had to really relook at the services that we're providing to our ELL students and knowing that we have released services to a lot of our ELL students too soon. And so we need to bring them back and make sure that we're serving them in their language acquisition support, not just literacy support. So we know that the research shows that ELL students need both. They need support in English language acquisition, but also the literacy support that all students receive. So we are kind of circling back and making sure that we're serving all those kids, the students, for longer periods of time. And then this is something relatively new, but our preschool programs will also be implementing a new screener starting next year that will allow us to better identify the students coming in from preschool, where those gaps are, and so we can respond immediately out of the gate when they start kindergarten. Questions?
One here, Noel, you're talking about enhancing support to ELL students, and specifically, I think within it's not just language acquisition, but it's beyond that. Because they're funding the additional funding for any ELL student is tied to that designation. So if they pass out of it, how do you provide that additional support for those students?
Well, these wouldn't necessarily be students who have passed out of ELL. We've had to prioritize historically who received direct services to students. And so we established kind of cut scores or language scores to say, well, if they're a level 4 or 5 student, we're no longer going to serve them because of resources, essentially. So they're still classified as ELL. They just didn't meet our kind of internal cut score. So we're having to reevaluate that and keep them with us for continued services, which will frankly result in larger group size that teachers will be serving. But we're rather than just kind of keeping an eye on them and paying close attention to them, we're actually going to continue to provide them direct services.
So there's kind of a triage then within ELL, so to speak. I mean, there's certain, and is that a function of what? Of lack of trained staff to assist those students, or I mean, how do you, if you have, is it we don't get enough?
It's actually a
funding per
function.
student?
I would say it's
how does that work?
We certainly don't get enough funding for a student because the ELL services that we provide are within the district are already subsidized by non-ELL funds, for sure. Not just the services that we provide students, but also for some of the outreach work that we do to families and parents. But it's not just a function of that. It's also a function of the length of the school day, the time that we have with them, because we in order to provide the extra support, we don't want to limit their exposure to the core curriculum that we're trying to move all of our students along with. So it does become a function of staffing somewhat, but also a function of just time that we have with them. Touches.
So an ELL student would be receiving core instruction. In addition, they may, depending on the progress that they're making, receive literacy support from the classroom teacher or an in-class support teacher in a small group setting. And then what they receive for ELL would be in addition to all of that. And that's where they would receive their targeted language support, which is different from what you would get in the classroom. It would be in addition to that.
So then does adding in ELL students at different levels require different professional development for the teachers that will be working with those students? I mean, are they asking them to do something different than what they've done in recent years?
I don't know that it's different. I think the same challenges are what we've always faced. If you had to pick students to then bring into those services, the higher language levels are, it's easier to do that with level 4 and 5 students who have more control of the language. It's just a matter about, it's a matter of being intentional about who we're serving, when we're serving them, and how we're serving them. And so I don't know that it necessarily changes how we train teachers, how we support teachers. It's just serving more kids.
Well, I think the only thing I would add to that is the idea of time, going back to the length of day. A student that maybe has just arrived with zero English language acquisition is going to require more time in an ELL setting than in particular, maybe core instruction where everybody else is. It doesn't mean that the instruction necessarily changes or the style changes. There's some additional strategies that can be in place for sure. But going back to the instructional framework, a common language around what good instruction is for our district is huge, even to address the specificity that's needed in terms of helping students in an ELL setting, even though that language may be, that particular part of the day for that student may be separate and not in the core English class, for example. Those effective strategies that worked in the core classroom still work in the ELL classroom, absolutely for sure. It is a universal, in Des Moines, instructional framework for all teachers. It's the time factor, I think, is probably the most important piece there. Does that help you? Does that help answer the question?
I think so. I think there's just a lot of different levels to it. For instance, I didn't understand that there was kind of a tiering of within the ELL population in this district. It was just something that had escaped me prior to now. So wrapping my mind around that and then trying to understand how instruction would change or what what happens, because that, and to me that's the population that if we can get it right, to put it way too simply, but if we can get it right, can be transformational for the district and significant in K-12 public education in general, and I think it's doable. But so just trying to understand kind of how that works with the additional information that I wasn't aware of is important to me.
And the higher the student's language level, the less intensive the support is, obviously. So we have the range of, like, in secondary, if you're brand new to the country, we have a lot of self-contained core classes where they're receiving content as well as language support. And then all the way up to our level 4 and 5 students who are integrated more in the regular classroom setting. They're doing everything else the other students are doing with this additional layer of language support that's less intensive than what our level 1s and 2s are getting. So it is differentiated, but I don't know that the strategies and the skills of the teachers are necessarily different for those types of populations. I mean, and we say this all the time, what's good for ELL students is also good for students in poverty. Who lack vocabulary, and so good teaching is good teaching, but definitely the intensity and the time varies depending on the level.
Thank you.
Could I get a refresher on what is our support for ELL from the state now? We got an extra year last year, or a point, or whatever, not an extra year, but a point.
Yeah, we got an extra year, yeah.
Okay.
We did get 3 years of weighting at .22 or .23 weighting, and we were able to get one additional year.
Right, okay, went to 4.
And as you recall, they created a task force to study what we had initially been pushing for in our legislation, when we were asking for 7 years of weighted funding at .23 and up to .33 if the student also was from poverty. And the task force actually came back with that recommendation, but the legislature has not taken further action. So we do have one more year than we used to have, which is significant for us and is certainly helping us extend services, but it's certainly inadequate.
Because we already have supplemented, we still supplement it to some degree, we're just supplementing it less. Because I agree with Rob on the fact of E of L, if we can figure that out. So what, in a way, I was trying to follow what you're doing. It's more intentional, is basically, you're being much more intentional with the kids that are behind, or ELL students than, because you're not really, you don't have more time in the day unless you're gonna have them stay over. I mean, so you're getting more time within that day.
Right, so, and I don't want to confuse like our multi-tiered system of support with just ELL.
Right.
So this multi-tiered system of support is in place for all students. And the ELL is in addition to this that provides language support. So I don't want to send the message that only our ELL students are eligible for intervention or receiving supplemental services. This is available and accessible to all students, including students on the high end. I want to keep that in mind, that once students have demonstrated mastery, once this is all in place, a true tiered system allows for extension as well. And so this is a system in place for all students that with the additional layer of ELL, knowing that that language support has to be there as well. Because the multi-tiered system it encompasses behavior, it encompasses, social, emotional, everything.
Our best research around ELL tells us that if we do everything right, and we have a student that's coming in with some language proficiency in their home language, that we need 7 years to achieve academic proficiency. That's where we came up with that 7 years of weighted support suggestion for the state. So following best research, for us to follow the best research, we certainly, our funding formula doesn't allow our staffing to reflect that. Not an excuse, but certainly that 7 years was not just pulled out of thin air. It's based in years of research that has changed very little, because part of it is the amount of time over a length of time, so that, because this is a huge ask for students, particularly those who are just initially being exposed to English after they've developed some literacy in their home language. It's harder the older they get, but 7 years we know is what's typical.
Am I remembering correctly that in the budget for next year, the one kind of increase in FTEs was ELL? Like
Yes.
11 positions, is that right?
I believe it was 11, yeah.
Does that start to address some of the gaps?
It starts to. We've steadily been increasing, and had we not had what we unfortunately anticipated and were correct in assuming about our budget for this upcoming year, we likely would have increased that number more. But as it stands, even with an increase of 11 positions, FTEs in ELL, our total number of staff overall will be about 47 FTEs less than what we had anticipated originally.
And essentially what
Not
that
in ELL overall, but.
Overall, okay. So essentially what that translates to is our ELL small group instruction, group size being about double what we would want it to be, at least in elementary.
Correct.
Well, you answered one of my questions, which was on the high side. The second one is going back to the subgroups. I see we had 3 this year. Well, the other, I believe it's 3 groups, if my math was I might have needed help. Will they be coming back with the same kind of snapshot as far as what you provided tonight with the groups that you showed tonight?
I think if that's something that,
So you want to see like
multi-race, things like
like multiracial, split out?
Well, maybe I'm wrong, but don't you think that the multiracial and the special ed and the white category, shouldn't they be addressed as far as coming back to the board, showing their progress or lack of progress? And I guess I'm asking that to the board. Would that be something that you would be interested in seeing the same snapshot that you saw tonight with the other groups?
I guess I'm thinking that these groups were pulled, and correct me if I'm wrong, because these are gaps that we've wanted addressed prior, when we've asked questions about.
And you're talking about those
Achievement.
last 3 graphs specifically?
I'm talking about just if this is going to be an ongoing baseline data that's going to be coming back, will it be all-inclusive or will it be just certain groups at certain times? That's...
yeah, I think we're more than able to do that. I think
So-
the request has been in the past for these particular subpopulations of African American, Hispanic, and
Right.
Asian. And so if that's
So-
something that the board would like to do,
I guess I'm asking, would it be to the board's advantage or to the board's pleasure that they would see what the entire picture?
So
Well, I think
each of these subpopulations broken out like those last 3 pages. Sorry.
I feel like we've got a decent picture with all the individual sub-pops with the previous slides, and the last few do just kind of provide another layer of how the different challenges that students face, whether they're English language learners, and then also, living in poverty, growing up in minority communities or as minorities, how those different things interact. And that's how I see those kind of being more illuminating. But we still have all the data for each of the individual sub-pops that you mentioned in tables 6 and 5 and 4. I guess I'm personally satisfied with that kind of picture.
I was going to say, as long as we're consistently reporting the macro and then boiling it down, as long as we have that same data consistently every year so we can indeed track, I'm fine with that. I don't know that I need to have everything disaggregated, but I do think that consistency in reporting and having the same information consistently year to year so that we have that baseline and we can refer back to that, to me, is probably a good place to be.
I'm good with that, too.
I just think too, on these 3 that we have, I think was an important breakdown, because I think I've asked before, who makes up the African American? Because we have a lot of ELL within the Asian, with all the Burmese, there's a lot of ELL that weren't in that number maybe 5 years ago. So that's why I'm fine with seeing this broken down, because I do think, to Nathan's point, a lot of the information is there, but I think it's important to realize that some of these subgroups have changed just by the student population that has made up these, in comparison to really over the last 5 years, in the influx of more ELL students. So I think it was important for me, it was important to say, okay, what does that impact, that number, and how does it impact? And I think when you start seeing the amount of students that are in those subgroups that are ELL, I think it's clearly I think it's changed dramatically in the last 5 years. Maybe it's longer. I think I've been here a while, but really over the last 5 years.
So will you come back with something on the special ed that shows 47% and 13 and 44% this year?
I don't know if I'm understanding your question there,
Which-
Mr. Howard.
Over which one are you at?
Which table?
Sent these typical growth trend subgroup, maybe I'm,
Oh, table 6?
yeah,
What are you saying? I'm sorry.
47, 44. Well, that's, to
Right.
me, that's pretty significant.
Oh. Well, even to go to the 53 and then down to the 44.
And we'll continue to provide that trend data every year from year to year.
I'm just saying, if you see something that sticks out like that does,
Perhaps that's,
that would be something that maybe the board would pique their interest. That's all I was trying
Sure.
You bet.
to bring up.
and maybe specific to this one data point, which is a very interesting data point because special education is the only group that went down from 13 to 15. That's the type of information that could be provided in Tom's weekly update. And then beyond that, the macro level point that I would make on this is, we came to agreement on kind of what the key indicators that we wanted out of this report. And then the supplementary information, we somewhat rely on you all to tell us the story and to explain to us the numbers behind the numbers that we asked for. So I do rely on you all to kind of give us what you think is the most significant information. But maybe Bill, if you're okay with that, that could be something that comes to us at the end of the week.
Well, I as a board, that's fine, but as the people out in the audience and the people in TV land, they won't have that advantage of having the weekly report. And so it's good information, I think, board or bad or good or whatever it is. I think it's good information to put out. And that's what we have this for. Again, I go back to that's why we had the television, is so that we do put out information to the people who can't make it to this board meeting set in this audience. As a board member, I have no problem with Tom's letter. That's good information for us. But again, it's not very transparent.
Isn't there going to be a lot of work talked about, I think, in one of those letters, or about redoing a lot of work on special ed? We have,
Yeah,
so maybe
actually,
that,
there's
is
going
that
to be
going to be
something
a
in here.
separate point? I don't think we've asked, but maybe that's where we get an update
No,
too.
I'm
No,
not-
just from the fact that there's a lot
Okay.
of work.
I just picked on special ed because poor special ed was the one. I'm just
Yeah, we
saying,
see the
That went
numbers.
down.
any particular one that there is, I think, for the sake of coming to the board and for people in the audience and people, and I keep calling them TV land, it's for their information. It's nice to have the advance information from the superintendent's letter, but it's not transparent. They don't have the advantage of the letter, I guess is what I'm saying.
So, just to clarify, and we could maybe treat this as a request for additional information, if the board agrees to it, are you asking for the special education group to be broken out from table 6 into a table similar to 7, 8, and 9,
What I am asking
to bring
is-
it back to the board, right?
I'm just saying, in the future,
Okay,
and I just picked on poor special ed, I mean, it could have been all students or somebody, I don't know, I just picked on them this week. That if we see something that would stick out like that, when you were doing your research, if you brought it back and included it in your presentation, kind of like you did tonight with the other 3 groups, I think with advance notice with Tom's letter, it would be good for transparency with people out there, that if the press was here or whoever was here and they picked up on that, we also have an explanation as to why, maybe it's an anomaly or something like that. That's all I'm.
And the only other reminder on that as a board too is we get this a week in advance. So if we have a question like that, we can certainly raise that
It just
anytime.
gives you a
prior to.
chance to look at it, and if you do have a follow-up question, you can follow it up, and you can also bring it, I'm just trying.
Point well taken. Thank you. I have a question. I appreciate the report, and I think it speaks to some of the things that we've talked about in terms of key performance indicators and ways that we can really get our arms around the subpopulations and sort of enhance this information by sort of layering on additional pieces of information that paint a more complete picture. I think my question, though, goes to the notion of, you guys talked about game changers and what we can do around ELL and the impact that that will have. But I do think that there probably are other things that potentially could be happening, should be happening, that really allow us to move the needle in a more aggressive way. I think that, one of the things we've talked about is just sort of that, nice and easy does it, or slow and steady. And for a lot of kids, slow and steady is going to leave them way behind, Because 5 years from now, they're not going to be where they need to be academically in order to be able to do the things that we would want any of our students to be able to do. So my question is, what are those interventions that can greatly accelerate growth or proficiency? Are we identifying some of those? Are those embedded in these key strategies that you've identified at the end of the report? But I mean, even when we talk about strengthening core classroom instruction, I mean, you're going to spend time, enhancing the skill set of teachers, but over time, those kids who are in those classrooms where the teacher skills are not where they need to be are still consistently sort of being left behind. So what is that thing? What are those things that we can do to greatly accelerate growth and proficiency with our students? Because I'm concerned that this sort of slow and steady is going to work maybe, but for those kids that are already behind and those kids that really need a lot of support, I'm concerned that we're not going to be doing what we need to do to honor our responsibilities to them.
So we have the same concerns, and we've talked numerous times about how do we accelerate this, because it's going in the right direction, but as you said, it's not rapid enough and it's not accelerated enough. So because this is an early literacy report, I'll talk early literacy specifically. So we didn't go so fine grain in our next steps to talk about specific strategies, but we have to accelerate the acquisition of foundational reading skills right away in kindergarten. We have, from a curriculum standpoint, and I've been in secondary for the last few years, but coming in, my expertise is early literacy, and just looking at the way we've laid things out, things are designed for 1 year's growth. That's what programs do. We teach things in the sequence of the program, and it's designed to get us 1 year's growth in 1 year's time. So we have some work to do, and we've already actually started that work at one of our elementary schools who did take a more accelerated approach, for example, implemented some very specific strategies, and their data far exceeded the district average. And so now we're looking at, we got to scale that up, because they've experienced success in a really short amount of time, and they've done that with the support of our AEA folks. So it is a matter of, it's never going to be a magic bullet, but it's a matter of saying, this worked here, we need to scale that up. Because if we can get acquisition of early literacy skills under the belt by kindergarten, first grade, accelerate that out of the gate, we're going to be obviously in a lot better position rather than playing catch up. So we know that we need to do some things programmatically a lot faster than what we've done historically.
So would it be possible to get more information on that particular intervention? I'm intrigued by that. I'd like to know more about that, just to help me understand ways that we can be more articulate about those things that work. When we get questions, we can certainly respond accordingly, but I certainly would like to get more information on that.
Absolutely.
That would be very helpful for me.
The only other thing that I would add to that is a little bit more, robust in the sense that it's not strategy specific, but it absolutely is for leadership in terms of a hyper focus on 3 common work areas: multi-tier system of support, SRG, and instructional framework. And what you see in front of you today are 4 different departments all talking about the same thing, because it's the common work of our district. We have not had that in the past. We're to a point now where we're all 4 in these 4 different departments working on the exact same thing, maybe in a different role and to a different depth, depending on who we serve in terms of building leadership versus instructional coaches and things like that. But we are to a point now where we are absolutely working on the exact same things every day to improve learning in classrooms. And I love what you, in terms of the aggressiveness approach, because absolutely, it's not good teaching if there's not learning taking place. And so that's how we're getting to a point where we are now monitoring effective instruction through the lens of learners. If we're not learning, then it's not happening.
Yeah, I would just echo too your comment, Terry, because you're exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
If we have students in a classroom where the teacher is not as effective as we would like for them to be, how are we accelerating progress for the teacher so that we are getting the results that we see from the learner perspective? So the implementation of this common instructional framework, which we've never had in the district before, which our teachers, I will tell you, who've been exposed to it so far have been extremely positive and responsive to. That language that we're using with those teachers, with the instructional coaches, is exactly the same language that the directors who are supervising our principals and supporting our principals in making accurate assessments of teacher performance in action and providing responsive PD to those teachers as we move through the year, and not a one-shot deal where we say, well, here's the plan for the year, and this is what we're going to do, whether it's going to be responsive to the student needs or not. We're getting to a point where we can actually have those strategic conversations, and as Matt said, and this is probably most important, that the Office of Academics and Office of Schools, though the responsibilities are very different, are pushing the organization forward in the same direction for that same ultimate end result, which is accelerated performance by the students. One other point I do want to make, and there's some italicized asterisk notes at the beginning of the report, as a reminder that the alignment of the Iowa assessments to what the curriculum we're asking our teachers to teach is very poorly aligned. We know that. I've been, I'll own this, hemming and hawing about making an investment as a district in something that more accurately helps us assess where our students are. Because the alignment with the Iowa assessments is poor, but it's not just an alignment issue. It's the wrong type of assessment. It's not designed to measure growth. So we are piloting I'll get this, it's called the MAP, Measurement of Academic Progress. It's a pretty widely used around the country assessment developed by the Northwest Education Evaluation Association. It's a tool that I've used in the past. It actually reports student results out in terms of a RIT score, which is basically a growth score. It's something that can be, it's a computer adaptive test, so it takes students from where they are and helps give teachers information about what the next steps are in terms of supporting that student's development. And it's also an assessment that can be given multiple times over the course of the year to progress monitor using the same measure that will be the end measure. We're going to pilot that at one elementary and one middle school next year for two reasons. One, so that before we do a district-wide adoption, if we intend to do that, we know how to do that well. But also, hopefully, the legislature and the Department of Education will have a clear decision made about what, if any, change there's going to be in the state assessment, so we don't make an investment that will be duplicative of what the final decision for the state assessment is. Been dragging my feet on that because it's a really big investment, and we didn't want to head that in that direction and then have a new state assessment that we thought would actually cover that ground for us. But every year they delay that decision, so we are taking that step for next year too.
I had one other comment, and, this really goes to sort of I don't even know what the right term is, but it's really sort of to the HR side of, students being able to learn. And I know that oftentimes what ends up happening is some of the most challenging students, the ones that are in greatest need, often have the youngest, sometimes least experienced teachers. I know that that's not across the board, but there are times where it's clear that many of the teachers who are seasoned, who have, great skills, et cetera, opt to not necessarily stay in the schools where they are needed the most. So are there any things that we are doing to incent, our best and brightest teachers to be in the buildings where the students need them the most? And are there ways that we can create a system that does just that if we're not doing it now? Because I don't spend a lot of time in buildings, but I do spend a little bit of time in a few buildings, at least one, in my neighborhood. And it's clear, some of the more challenging students oftentimes are with those teachers who are less tenured and least experienced. And that just doesn't work. And so I think it's something that we really have to figure out somehow, some way.
Well, that's an excellent point, and something that certainly involves our collective bargaining agreement for sure. But something that we are doing that I think will address that is, and we'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about my proposed goals, is the development that we're working on with the support of the Wallace Foundation, as a matter of fact, but it'll really be a collaboration between Human Resources and Office of Schools in developing, it's not just a leadership pipeline, but a better way to identify our talent, not just for hiring, but also who we have currently on staff. So we actually are not just basing it on years of experience, which oftentimes is true, but oftentimes is not true, so that we can actually identify where the best talent is and then work out ways to get those folks serving the kids that most need their support. One thing I will say that we have done, and I'm very proud of our principals for taking this on, we've been very strategic when we have a principal opening, particularly at elementary, because we have more elementary schools and therefore more openings, is assessing the needs of that school and then assessing the strengths that our current principals have and asking some of our best principals to take on some of the most challenging buildings. And we have several examples of where that has paid off very, very well in the last 3 or 4 years. And I'm very proud of our current staff to be willing to take on that challenge where they really have nothing to gain personally, because it's a harder job and something that's somewhat starting over. And that's worked out very well for us. So we are attuned to that issue, but we haven't certainly solved it in the teacher ranks. But something very much.
We have seen, though, in those buildings where we have made those leadership changes, bringing someone in with a great skill set and a lot of experience, that, you know, they're pulling a staff together, improving the culture and climate of the building. Staff are choosing to stay. We aren't seeing a lot of the transfers out of the buildings that we have in the past. And so we've noticed that.
And one of the things that you make a great point is that we worked very closely, HR has worked very closely with the Office of Schools in identifying talent and making sure those people that we've identified as leaders have the rich, varied experience with a lot of different settings, with a lot of different students, and a very diverse, with a lot of diverse experiences for them. So we recognize that. We do have to work within the parameters of the, you know, the master contract, the comprehensive agreement, but we've worked a lot with transfer already with DMEA leadership, and we'll continue to do that. We do recognize that, though. That's a great point.
Thank you.
I guess my comments come around we talked about FAST, and I understand that as a screener. I just wanted to make sure and point out what Tom mentioned about the fact that this is mandated screening that will eventually be telling us about third grade retention, just so everybody caught that point. I think what we're using it for is great. What they're using it for is scary.
Right.
So just because one tool to determine whether or not a third grader gets to move forward or not is, I think that's a bad idea. The other thing I was going to ask about, and it was on the slide previous to this, was the pre-K assessment that's going to be implemented, I think you said next year. Is that right?
Yeah, one of the things, we had met at the end of the year and had talked with Carolyn in regard to what some of our benchmark data was showing at the end of the year. And there were just questions around, you know, what does that look like in relationship to the FAST assessment? And really, the benchmark data was measuring growth and progress over the year for kindergarten, and it wasn't necessarily aligning with the data that they're utilizing with FAST. And
Okay.
so we are going to take a preschool version of that
Okay.
and pilot and implement that at the preschool level, and we're currently getting staff trained in order to do that.
Okay. And then would it make sense once that is implemented to, I know this is an elementary literacy report, but to include that so that we can see and see how, somehow see how preschool impacts our literacy, or no preschool, how no preschool essentially impacts our
Pretty
literacy.
compelling data currently.
Right, but we don't see
that
it on
shows
this, yeah.
It's not included, correct?
So the governor and lieutenant governor and his special assistant, I think she's called for education, were at Monroe a few weeks ago looking at our Starfish program. And a point that I tried to lift up to the governor and his team was that they asked, well, how many students are we serving in this particular building? It was Monroe, and we were serving, I think, 62 kids this summer, but we could identify about 300 kids that should have that full day summer school experience to help accelerate their growth, because it's a very high percentage of ELL and a very high percentage poverty. And so the question was raised, well, when we get to the third grade retention year, what are we anticipating our needs are? And right now, we don't have good data because we just have the 1 year of fast data for 2 grade levels. But our projections would be between 400 and 500 students. And he says, well, how are you going to pay for that? And I said, well, we haven't really figured that out yet. But another number that's very interesting is that we know we have 1,000 4-year-olds in this district who are not receiving preschool, let alone high quality preschool. And that would be a much wiser investment. To give these kids some acceleration, because I got to tell you, I have immense respect for teachers, but our kindergarten teachers, I just don't know how they do it. I mean, it's amazing what they're faced with, and the challenges that our kids bring in, and well over half of them have very little of the skills they need, even social skills they need to be successful in school. And so we have a very, very tall ask of all of our early grade teachers. All of our teachers have very important and very difficult jobs, but in those early grades, particularly kindergarten, we need more time. We need more time, and we need time earlier. So preschool is just huge in helping us move the needle with this population.
We'll be discussing that when we on our legislative priorities. I was going to bring up, it's very clear when you look at the scores or any assessment, whether even an Iowa assessment, which is not the best, that preschool is critical for kids that live in poverty or ELL. It's even more critical. If we can get them on the road started right, they can do well, and they do well. But
Absolutely can.
It's totally unfair that we are not providing these kids with more preschool. Just my preschool statement for the beginning. We'll have more at the legislative priority, because it just makes so much sense. It's just scary that it has to take this long for people to figure it out.
Right.
Well, don't worry, our educational governor will be,
Gonna
I'm
figure
sure
it out.
he'll be right on the spot there and
That's why he cut it when he came in.
you know.
Thanks, Bill. Anybody else? Okay. May I please have a motion and a second to accept item E1, elementary literacy monitoring report?
So move.
Motion by Mr. Howard, second by Ms. Caldwell Johnson. Please vote. Motion passes 7-0. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay. Hold on. Okay. I think I've got it here. Next item on our agenda is item E2, staff compensation FY 2016 for teachers. No presentation, but Ann Sullivan is here if anybody has any questions. May I please have a motion and a second to accept item E2, staff compensation FY 2016 for teachers?
I have only one comment. It's that I
We
was-
can discuss once we have a motion and a second.
Oh, okay,
So
I'll give it the
motion
motion.
I'll second.
Okay,
Now, do you
go
want-
ahead, Mr. Howard.
My only comment is I'm glad to see the part about the employee contribution for the insurance, because the HVAC group has really worked hard over the last 3 or 4 years to get this implemented or brought on board. And I just want to say kudos to those people, because they have put a lot of time and effort into it and took a lot of flack, to be honest, from their groups that they represent. So that's all.
Thanks. Anybody else? Okay, we have a motion by Mr. Howard, second by Ms. Bozen. Please vote. Motion passes 7-0. Next item on our agenda is E3, staff compensation FY 2016 for administration specialists and paraprofessionals. Again, no presentation for this item, and Ann is here if we have any questions. May I please have a motion and a second to accept E3 staff compensation FY 2016 administration specialists and paraprofessionals?
Second.
Okay, any discussion?
Just when we say total, that is total insurance and the whole gambit.
Yep. Just like with the teachers. Yep.
Okay, we do have a motion and a second on the floor. No further discussion, please vote. Motion passes 7-0. Next item on the agenda is item E4, IASB Legislative Priorities for FY16. This is a discussion item, and we have the proposed priorities given to us, and do you want to open up the discussion, Tom?
Sure, and it's it actually falls into many of the discussion items we had relative to the elementary literacy progress monitoring report. One thing I will call attention to, though, is the at-risk and dropout prevention allocations based on need. We've made a little bit of progress in the flexibility and rules that allow us to spend those dollars where we most need to. And if you saw in the progress monitoring report, the term at-risk is now being used by the state for kids in early literacy. We've been saying that for years, but they've made it virtually impossible for us to invest those dollars where we can extend time for kids at the early grades, where we can we can react more quickly and much more effectively with those resources. So we're going to continue to push for that. But I think an area that deserves more attention is actually basing the funding of those, or the allocations of those funds on need rather than student population. The at-risk or at-risk allowable growth, we used to call it, is based on per capita, and it's on property tax generated locally. So students around the state generate essentially the same number of dollars regardless of characteristics. So a district of 32,000 students with our demographics and a district of 32,000 students with almost no ELL and no poverty would generate essentially the same number of dollars. That does not help us address effectively the gap that those challenges bring to getting the same end results for kids. And so the state overall, if you think globally, could spend the same number of dollars to prevent dropouts and to address the needs of at-risk students and get a much greater return on investment if we targeted those funds to those students who demonstrate that they have at-risk factors or are at risk of dropping out. So that one thing would be in alignment with much of what the governor wants to do in terms of property tax relief, and could actually, I think, help us more effectively address the gaps that the vast majority of our kids bring in as they enter school compared with many of our metro colleagues. So that's one thing that we haven't talked about extensively, but something that I think could go a long way toward us bridging some of those gaps that we had talked about. We do have an issue of time. Students who need additional support, and we have the same length of school day, they either get more support and miss out on something else that we think is very important, or you provide them what we used to call support for literacy, for instance, by removing them from core instruction. And so you're literally enabling them to get further behind. So those the additional years, weighted years of funding for ELL in terms of overall price tag for the state is minuscule, but is the right thing to do for students who bring that challenge of learning English as a second, or in some cases third or fourth language, to the table with them to school. And universal 4-year-old preschool. Now that's something that you all may want to debate, whether we advocate for universal 4-year-old pre-K or some sort of needs-based. I guess I would take whatever we can get, but certainly I think universal 4-year-old preschool in this day and age should be something akin to what we now think of as full-day kindergarten. That used to be the anomaly, and now it's the standard. And I think 4-year-old preschool should be the standard in our state as well. So that's my opening comments, and I'll turn it over to the board.
And just as a reminder, these are items that we would forward to the IASB for consideration among their document for legislative priorities. So this is separate and can stand differently from what we determined for our own district's legislative policy or priorities.
Tom, you piqued me. Just how would a school district that doesn't have a dropout problem per se, how would they spend the same funds that we spend? What would they spend it on?
Well, they can provide much more intensive support for the relatively small number of students who need it, is number one. And number two, quite frankly, some of the rules that get into our way, that the state has created, was to prevent districts who don't really need it from spending it in foolish ways, I guess. So some of the things that some districts literally are looking for ways to spend the money. Yeah, when you have a 96 or 97% dropout rate, what do you do with dropout prevention funds?
So essentially you give it back at the end of the year?
No, you look for creative ways to spend it.
Oh, I was trying to be.
Yeah.
That
does happen
It
on
just
occasion, I'm
doesn't
sure.
seem, I should know better than this. It just doesn't seem logical, but.
Well, it doesn't to me either, but I think if you looked at when those rules were created, it probably made a lot more sense when the student population in the state was much more homogeneous from river to river. And it's changed dramatically, especially in pockets. And so in places like Des Moines, our population looks way different than it did in the early 70s, as it does in a lot of other areas, rural and urban. So the
But it
unfortunately
is changing.
the fund
The dynamics and the demographics are changing from, when I say we, the big cities. We're just the advanced guard. It's filtering down to the smaller districts. I mean, it's just taken longer to get there.
Well, yeah, but it's also more intense in certain areas. There are certain communities like Perry and Denison and some others that experience it more acutely, which is why I say, the price tag on some of these things for the state would be rather small. I think the return on investment could be rather large, but I think in terms of at risk in general, poverty especially, the variance between districts has been exacerbated a lot when you have some fast-growing suburban districts with a very, very small poverty percentage, and then you have some small rural communities and some large urban communities like ours that are sort of ballooning in that population where others aren't. That funding formula, to me, no longer makes good sense.
Little education, huh?
Yeah.
Can I, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Nathan.
I just want to ask a more questions about process. So we send these to IASB, then how does it get decided and who
Right.
decides?
And that's what I've been frantically trying to page through to find the letter.
Well, if you don't
which I
know,
don't
I
have
mean,
it,
if you
but
want
yeah,
to
I
keep
can
on
let you
doing that, we
know.
can, okay.
Unless somebody else.
Well, I'm
has
also
that
wondering
right.
about the plausibility of, I mean, that third item sounds great, but it sounds like it's also going to mean a lot of school districts around the state will get less money, where Des Moines will get more money.
Yes.
Oh, good
yeah.
point.
Yes, that would be true.
Okay.
But when you look at it when you talk about, we can recognize clearly, and the state certainly has recognized this with the third grade retention law, that there are gaps. And to say that we have money allocated to close those gaps, but then we don't distribute it in a manner that allows the gap to be closed, it just doesn't make any basic sense. And I've been able to successfully articulate this to individuals on both sides of the aisle. But you're right, the political will be very challenging. However, there are a number of smaller districts who would benefit
Right.
as well. So, and there are some of our neighboring districts who readily acknowledge this and would be supportive.
If they were concerned about kids and the welfare of everyone, they might take this, but they probably wouldn't maybe adopt this as one of their platforms.
Right.
And I was going back to the universal preschool. I do believe everybody needs it, but I guess I'm just looking at reality when we have a governor who cut it when he came in. My proposal would be that we really try to get it for sure weighted, or at least weight it for kids of ELL, poverty, especially all the things that we get waiting for. So that the one where those students are would get almost a full day every day. I mean, just looking at the total numbers, I think it's great maybe to ask, but I I'm really more concerned about the kids we're serving, I guess, but I know this is going on to the total picture, but if you could weight it so that the kids that really do need it, the 1,000 kids that don't enter our doors because they either can't get there because of transportation or all the issues that compound that. So that would be the only thing I would switch.
I wouldn't disagree. I think the challenge is oftentimes those are the hardest ones to get there.
Right.
They don't understand the importance and/or value of it. And so, I mean, as much as I like the concept, I don't want to cut off our nose to spite our face either.
Right, right.
Yeah, if you just made it mandatory, make it a lot easier, wouldn't it?
So here's what's going to happen. Once we've decided what we're sending, I found it. The IASB Legislative Resolutions Committee at its August meeting will review the submitted resolutions, prioritize them, and make recommendations to the IASB Board of Directors. And then at the IASB Board of Directors at its September meeting will vote to approve or modify those recommendations and forward the report to the Delegate Assembly. And then the Delegate Assembly will meet in Des Moines on November 18th, and they will, that's the official body that establishes the IASB legislative priorities, resolutions, and beliefs. So that's the process.
Thank you.
You bet.
It might make sense then to shape, particularly on this issue, Connie, because I think the points you bring up are reasonable, but it might be worthwhile to think about what we think would get more traction, in November, because I think that's a really important issue, and whether if it makes more sense to really go for universal preschool with all the school districts, or if it makes if it's a more compelling case to say, well, obviously we don't have the money, but we should allocate it based on need. I'm not actually sure which way that goes down, but.
Maybe that's a compromise.
That would be the lens that I would look at it, at trying to figure out.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
all
or
different.
it could be, you could just have like a fallback.
Yeah.
Well, I also think that we have to keep in mind that because of the representation at IASB, is that what it is? Yeah, IASB, that as much as these issues are really, in my opinion, focused on the needs of some of the larger urban districts, the representation doesn't necessarily reflect that same demographic. And so trying to figure out, of these three things, which is of the greatest importance to us as a large district that we would really push on, recognizing that there are going to be a lot of competing, demands on whoever the resolutions committee is.
Right, yes.
But I do think we have to really sort of reflect back on the people who are making the decisions, number one, and the size and type of districts they represent, number two. So I think as much as all of these are really important, I also think that our ability to gain traction is going to be based on the one that probably has the greatest universality across all districts, all sizes, all demographics.
And I can tell you what they already have as part of their legislative platform, which they ask whether keep, amend, delete, or submit new related to the topic. For preschool access, they say supports an increase in funding to ensure all 4-year-olds have access to a high-quality public school preschool program. The increase should include transportation and facility development costs. We should continue to allow 4-year-olds to be included in the enrollment count if those programs can demonstrate meeting the collaboration and quality standards requirements of the statewide voluntary preschool program. So
they've already got it.
they've got that, and they are including transportation and facility development. They do not have anything in regards to by need. And just as another point here, and I apologize for not bringing this up before, but as I'm looking at their, as at the priorities that they do have 45 of them. So
Yeah, they
let's
always
just
have a
remember
ton.
that,
So-
yeah,
No priorities.
Oh, that's what, in November, it goes on for a long time. I mean, whenever they do that, so,
right.
yes. It's like where you have so many that nothing means. So I think this is ceremonial to send it in, actually. So,
Well, I don't disagree, but I felt since we were new members
we
again
should
to
be-
ASB, I
We'll
I
be
at least want them to
participants.
know that that we're paying attention, and that we do have an agenda. And when Thomas and I were meeting with the new executive director, was it about this time last year? We did float the idea that since we're 50 times larger than the median school district, that perhaps
Someone.
our weight
Delegates.
in discussions like this, or delegates, should be weighted equally, but that idea was not,
That got shot down,
was
didn't
not
it?
welcomed, right?
I think this was a worthwhile conversation, though, as we go forward with our own, as well as whatever we want to influence for Urban Education Network priorities.
It might be worth recommending that they also, cap it at 5 priorities or something along with it.
Oh, we could.
that would be a good idea.
Help me, isn't this the one we kind of looked with a critical eye about rejoining this organization? Maybe this is a good test to see just how much, I don't want to know if I want to use the word influence, but it's a nice word. Because I'm thinking other larger metropolitan districts that belong to it would be probably looking critically, the same way.
Not all of them have rejoined.
Well, it would definitely give them pause if what we submit gets shot down, So, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, it's a good trial balloon maybe to put out there.
Right. Yeah, I'll be very curious to see where this goes.
I do think it would be good to put the caveat that we think that there's too many priorities and to narrow it down to get more focus, so we'll be more impactful and make that comment to it.
Happy to. Everybody good on that? Thank you. Okay, the next item on our agenda is item E5, Audit Committee Update, and this is an information item as well. There is not a presentation. Oops, we did get the report with the agenda. Is there any discussion or any questions regarding that update? Okay.
No.
Thank you. All right, next on the agenda, we have items of privilege, Chair's report. I have nothing at this time, but I will pass the torch to Mr. Barron to talk about this weekend's event.
Thank you. Hopefully the folks who pay attention to the school board meetings are aware of the upcoming school board election in September, just about 2 months from today, roughly. And there will be 4 districts up on the ballot this year. And as part of this process and as part of preparing the incoming board members to hit the ground running, we're offering a session on Saturday here in this room at Central Campus in the boardroom at 9 a.m., free of charge, lunch provided, on what it takes to be a school board member, what our board policies lay out, what the role is for one school board member versus the entire school board versus the superintendent versus the constituents at large. We did something similar in February when Toussaint Cheatham resigned, and it was a very well-received session. We're bringing back the same person to do it. There'll be some changes, some new wrinkles this time around, but it's a very interactive, discussion-based program and worthwhile for anyone who is thinking about running for the school board, who has interest in the way the school board works, who wants to better understand what we do and why we do it, and how we could do better at it. Then I would encourage anyone to sign up. You can go to Des Moines Schools website. It is literally our website effectivegov.gov. dmschools.org/effectivegov.gov to sign up. Please sign up. We will be providing lunch. We want to know how many people we need to provide lunch for. Thank you.
Thank you. And superintendent's report.
Well, we did two full days into FY16. We know what our state funding is going to be, so that's a nice thing to know. There is some talk that there's an effort among some of our legislators to force a reconvening of the legislature to try to overturn the governor's veto of the one-time funding. I will say that as a district, we were very responsive in anticipating a 1.25% increase, that being it. However, there's a lot of good that could be done for our kids with that one-time money, and I think we would expend that in a very judicious way that would help move the arrows forward faster. So I would certainly advocate for you all reaching out to whomever your contacts are in the legislative world and encourage them to consider reconvening to see if the governor might, we might be able to reverse the governor's decision on that line item veto. The chances of that happening probably slim to none, but taking a few moments to reach out wouldn't hurt anything. That's all I have.
All right, with that, I will adjourn the meeting. We'll reconvene shortly for our closed session, so 5 minutes, and then followed by our work session.